Hello, my name is Lars Howlett. Thank you for joining me here today. There's a couple of empty seats here in the front. If you're in the back of the room, I can see it's a little crowded, or at least I hope it is. Also, there's tea and coffee in the kitchen. I hope you have enjoyed that. And in all seriousness, I wish we could be together in Colorado for the Energy Healing Conference, but I'm glad that we are able to truly be healing beyond borders this year and taking this online. So thank you for joining me wherever you are. And I'm really excited at the invitation of Lisa Anselm to share with you my experience of patterns of possibility, creating wholeness on the earth, our conference theme. So I am a labyrinth designer and builder. And sometimes when I say the word labyrinth, the first thing people think of is David Bowie and the movie Labyrinth from the 1980s. And indeed, if you Google the word labyrinth online, mostly what you will see is David Bowie. But to further cause confusion, even Webster's dictionary defines the labyrinth as a place of intricate passageways and blind alleys. A maze, or something extremely complex and tortuous, which is not my line of work. The reason for that misunderstanding about the word labyrinth in the common use is the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. So Daedalus was commissioned to create a labyrinth to house the Minotaur, and it was a space that was meant to be difficult to navigate so that the Minotaur could not escape. And Theseus himself needed the help of Ariadne using the red thread to wind his way through the maze to find the Minotaur in the center. So when I am actually building labyrinths, often people will ask me, how high is the hedge going to be? But again, we are thinking more of what we now consider to be a maze, which is something that has walls and is meant to disorient you or be a puzzle, dead ends, choices, and tricks along the way. And this is a self-portrait of myself at the hedge maze at the Dole Pineapple Plantation in Hawaii. But commonly today, labyrinths, especially in the United States, are considered to be a single winding pathway that navigates its way to the center. And instead of being a maze with walls, generally they are two-dimensional and flat to the surface, so that when you stand at the entrance, you can see the entire design and you can see the center. And this, to me, is also an image that reflects the feeling of a labyrinth, which is a feeling of calmness, of openness, spaciousness, of actually the opposite of chaos, but order and calm. So after we clear up the word labyrinth, usually people ask me, well, how did you become a labyrinth designer and builder? And actually, it's only been in the last 5 years that I've worked in this professionally. For the 15 years before that, I was a professional photographer, and I taught photography part-time at a high school in Atherton, California. And while I was teaching at this high school, they had a labyrinth built in the courtyard. So the first labyrinth that I actually ever saw in person was one that was kind of being puzzle pieced together by this master builder, Marty Kermeen. And he uses pavers, hand-cut pavers, to assemble these incredible, intricate labyrinths. And after the labyrinth was built, I went over, kind of out of curiosity, to see what it was all about. And there was simply an entrance and an invitation to walk that was carved into the ground in front of me. So I walked the labyrinth, and I found it to be kind of an interesting way to take time out of my schedule. At the school, things are so scripted that it was just such a breath of fresh air, literally, to go outside and walk the labyrinth and not have a time frame on the walk. It could take 10 minutes, it could take 20 minutes, it could take half an hour. And in winding my way through the labyrinth, I also saw that it calmed me down, and it allowed me to kind of decompress and get into the present moment and deal with the stresses that were coming up in my work. And if there was a difficult situation with a student, or especially during grading periods, I would use the labyrinth to kind of calm myself down and recenter. So I found it to be such a valuable tool for my own benefit that then I decided to start taking my students out to the labyrinth. And on the very first day of the semester, instead of handing out the syllabus and the assignment sheets and talking about the rules and expectations, we would simply walk out to the labyrinth and have a nonverbal experience as a class, walking and being together, after coming from all these different places, to navigate this space together for the first time, like we would be doing symbolically for the rest of the semester. And so we used it as a ritual, and then we would also walk the labyrinth on the very last day of the semester. And then we would use it as an opportunity to reflect on what we had learned, how we had grown, and the opportunities that we still wanted to grow and learn in our photography in the future. So it was really fascinating to watch the students experience the labyrinth, and it was also an opportunity for me to kind of introduce the labyrinth to them and say that the labyrinth is there for you, if ever you need it. During the course of the semester, they could go out and walk it alone by themselves. At that time, I had a serious breakup of a long-term relationship in my life, and really everything fell to pieces. And I moved out of San Francisco, where I was living with my partner, to the coast of Half Moon Bay. And so my life was in complete upheaval. And I realized that I needed a labyrinth for myself, not just to let go of stress from work, but to actually heal from this relationship. So I found an empty lot, and I got some rocks together and invited a few friends, and we assembled a 7-circuit classical labyrinth, just putting the rocks together. And you can see here I'm kind of scratching my head like, I don't know if this is going to work, but look at this. This is just moments after the labyrinth. Actually, we're still kind of putting the last stones in the labyrinth, but you can already see there's people helping create the labyrinth. There's people walking the labyrinth. There's all these different ages, ethnicities. I was shocked at just how the labyrinth brought in all these different people, almost like a magnet. And then I would go out to walk the labyrinth every day to kind of, process this loss. And standing in the center especially, I found the labyrinth to be a container and a sense of order in this time of chaos. And it became a real healing space for me. And I loved how the labyrinth really became a part of the land. It almost looked like it had been there forever. And I was working part-time as the photographer for the weekly newspaper there in Half Moon Bay, so I finally got up the courage to publish a photograph of the labyrinth because I had built it without permission. And the very next day I went, and it became bulldozed by the landowner. And, it was his private lot, so I had to respect that. I mean, it was kind of a shock, but a friend told me about another space along a coastal trail, which was on public land, so I thought I'd give that a chance. I went there, and I took my stick and drew the design on the earth, and then I used, again, rocks from the ocean. And it became an even better space for the labyrinth, really an incredible little point on the Pillar Point Bay. And there were 2 benches that just happened to be right next to it, almost as if they were built there waiting for a labyrinth to be right next to it. So I would go out and walk it, every day or so. And again, I was just captivated by the transformation of the space. Weeds started growing up in between the stones, flowers blooming, I would walk it in the rainy season, and normally I wouldn't be out for a walk in the rain, but to go out and visit the labyrinth was actually an invitation to get me out when otherwise I wouldn't have gone out. And there I saw a rainbow on the horizon, walking through the puddles and the mud, which again became a good metaphor for really what was going on in my life. And then I took friends out to the labyrinth when they visited, and it was a great way to also connect with friends and family who were visiting me. And again, I was often shocked when I went out to the labyrinth that there would be somebody else already on the path. Sometimes I would have to wait, for the labyrinth to open up for my own personal meditation. And you see this couple there in the center with their dog on a foggy day, and it almost looks as if they kind of just got sucked into the labyrinth and found their way to the center and are like, what are we doing here? What is this? And I love that about labyrinths, is that sometimes people just stumble upon them not really knowing what they are, and just really have their own experience of discovering them on their own. So after about a year, I felt like my healing process had been complete, that I had moved through that period of my life and I was on steady ground again. And so I decided to take all the stones from the labyrinth and throw them back into the ocean on the spring equinox. And for me, it was a ritual of like the weight has lifted, really, off of the labyrinth. And the very next day, a friend came to me and said, Lars, someone destroyed your labyrinth. And I said, destroyed? You mean the rocks are gone? And they said, yes, someone took all the rocks away. And I said, well, I did that. I threw the rocks into the sea. And they said, you destroyed your own labyrinth? And I said, actually, I didn't destroy it. It's still there. It's, if you see the labyrinth as the rocks, then it's gone. But the labyrinth is not really the materials. It's actually not even the design. The labyrinth is the experience. It's the journey. And so because the weeds had grown up between the rocks, you could now walk the labyrinth through the living, through the living plants, and walk the form that way. And they said, oh, you can still walk it. I said, yeah, of course you can still walk it. I said, oh, great. So it was kind of an interesting, also reflection on non-attachment, which I had learned from my first labyrinth being bulldozed. So people would walk the labyrinth that way, but after the fall came and then it was the dry season, most of the weeds kind of died down, and then I did rebuild the labyrinth. But the very next day, after rebuilding the labyrinth, I went to visit it, and someone had changed it into a wave instead of the 7-circuit classical labyrinth. And I thought, oh, this isn't going to work, I'm going to have to fix this. Someone's messing with me, So, but I thought, wait a second. Let me just walk this and see if it works as a labyrinth. And sure enough, it's a different choreography or pattern, but you end up in the curl of the wave, and that becomes the center of the labyrinth. And I thought, well, that's kind of a cool design, especially this was the pathway to Mavericks, which is a giant surf break in Half Moon Bay. And so I thought in some ways this design even better reflects the community and the environment, which is really now the labyrinth is really, it's not even mine, it's the community's labyrinth. So who am I to say, really what it should be? But then the next day, somebody else came and changed it back to the classical labyrinth. So I thought, oh my gosh, a lot of people are really invested in this labyrinth. So then the next day, I changed it back to the wave formation, and because I liked it so much, and then it stayed as a wave for the rest of maybe 5 or 6 years that it lived. And I also really appreciated having a new path, a new pattern to walk, in that new period of my life. That really it was a metaphor for me to really ride the waves of this period of change and transition, into my new chapter of life. And the labyrinth really is a mirror. It can reflect to you, the twists and turns of your life journey, that sometimes you think you are getting closer to your goal, and then you end up being further away from your goal. And then sometimes you are right around the corner and you don't even realize it. And so many people find the labyrinth to be really illuminating in terms of understanding the twists and turns of their own life. And I love this quote by Jeff Sayward, who's the preeminent historian of labyrinths. He says, throughout the long history of labyrinths, whenever and wherever society is going through rapid change and development, the labyrinth has blossomed. Now, humanity is seeking the sure path of the labyrinth in an uncertain and confusing world. So I feel like that happens to us as individuals at certain times of our lives, and you see that people come to the labyrinth, when they go through life transitions or are grieving a loss. And now as a society, we are also collectively going through this major transition and grieving the losses that we have had through the pandemic. Another reason I believe labyrinths have come back into consciousness in the last 20 years is the idea of sacredness and what is sacred in our lives. And it almost comes to the point where you ask the question, is nothing sacred? Because of our hyperconnectivity with cell phones and the internet, because we are working from home so much, there seems to really be no sacred time or space in our lives. And if you Google the word sacred, you can not only see the definition, but you can also see a graph of the use of the word sacred in publications and written books from 1800 to 2019. And what you see is, Google has been scanning and scanning and scanning books. And so this graph shows that the use of the word sacred with a lowercase s has been in decline, severely from the 1800s to just about, the mid to late 80s, early 90s, which correlates in some ways to when the labyrinth came back into consciousness in the United States, was in the early 1990s, about 30 years ago. So labyrinths create sacred space because they have a defined perimeter that marks a specific precinct. There's a gateway to enter into that special domain. There has a designated pathway that directs your focus and your journey within. They're created with intention, sometimes consecrated or blessed through a ceremony. They're intended for spiritual, religious, or personal reflection or stress reduction. They are an ancient archetype that has symbolic meaning and historic tradition, and they're meant to be respected, free from distractions or other activity. I.e., if you have a labyrinth, you should walk around it, instead of walking through it, on a daily basis. And then they're also formed with sacred geometry in their design and often by proportion. So sacred geometry refers to the geometry of nature, and that there's an underlying balance and design to all of life, and that you can express that through geometry. And it's not really math, more as shape, and value in the way that a flower is optimally expressing itself. And there's a variety of ways, obviously, that you can express through this sacred geometry the best form for living. And labyrinths use geometry in both obvious and subtle ways. And so I use a compass and ruler to draw my designs on graph paper before creating them. And I use the geometry to not only form the circles of the labyrinth, but I also use it to create symbolic meaning, like the seed of life that I drew in the center of this labyrinth. And this is in a public park in Vallejo, California. And you can see here's the finished painted labyrinth with the seed of life in the center. And it was oriented towards a rose garden. And so I felt like the seed of life could could engage and reflect the rose garden in the space of the park. And if you look in history, you see symbols. The labyrinth is another symbol, like the seed of life, that have kind of evolved together, side by side sometimes. This is a artifact in the Gotland History Museum in Sweden, and it shows a labyrinth carved on an ironing board next to the carving of a seed of life pattern. And this may be 200 years old, this ironing board. So in other places on Earth, labyrinths have risen, into consciousness. And then now labyrinths are kind of out of consciousness in Sweden, but they're in consciousness in the United States and Australia and other parts of South Africa. Another way we see sacred geometry kind of expressing itself in our culture and throughout time, throughout history, is the mandala. And, again, these are using geometric forms to create symbolic reflections of life or spirituality or, it's a meditative practice to create the mandala and then also to look at it. And that could also be similar to a Native American medicine wheel, which also is a geometric pattern that has evolved in time and used for understanding and connection of ourselves and spirit and, the journey through life. So the base pattern for creating a labyrinth then usually is the circle, and the circle is the container for the space. And this is a calligraphy by Thich Nhat Hanh, which I really love. And what he does is he places his brush at the bottom of the piece of paper, and in a meditative state, he inhales, doing 1/3 of the circle, and then exhales, completing the circle. So this is a representation of one breath of life. And, perhaps a circle is all you need for your meditation or your reflection or your connection to the divine. And, I have a meditation cushion, which is in the shape of a circle. And, if you Google search meditation, then this is what you see, is people sitting on their cushion or out in nature. And this is how people often think of meditation. But what I love about Thich Nhat Hanh is that he practices sitting meditation, but he also practices eating meditation and walking meditation and drinking tea meditation and painting meditation, calligraphy. So that's me in the back, kind of a little head above everybody else, as I'm 6'3", and we're practicing a walking meditation with Thich Nhat Hanh at a retreat in Canada. And that is a moving meditation, an embodied practice. And you can use a pathway as a space for meditation walking. And then that would be formed just simply by 2 lines. You would just have the path, designated where you are going. And the Camino de Santiago is another kind of pilgrimage that has really come into consciousness. I mean, people have been walking the Camino for hundreds of years, but now more than, I don't know now more than ever, but now especially there are hundreds of thousands of people that are using the Camino as a personal pilgrimage, as a way to understand their life journey and to reflect, especially in times of transition or loss or change, upheaval. Now, if you don't have the time to go on a long-distance pilgrimage like that, then you could do a walking meditation in a circle. And this is a photograph of a art installation by Richard Long, which is a walking circle in the Himalayas. And so you could walk in a circle, and often that's actually what we do in our lives. Lauren Archer says, when she was getting burnt out as the canon pastor of Grace Cathedral during the AIDS epidemic, she was literally walking in circles around her apartment, wondering, how can she reinvent herself? Now, to create a labyrinth, you might think that you need an entrance, a center, and a circular pathway. So this could be maybe a one-circuit labyrinth which might be the simplest form. You enter into the special domain, you walk around in the, there's no dead ends or choices, and then you arrive at the center and you have your meditation. But what this is actually a spiral. So just like this nautilus shell, which is expressing a form of sacred geometry, it's actually, the golden spiral represented by the Fibonacci sequence. But many people walking the spiral find that it is dizzying, especially if you're doing it, many, many circuits, like a labyrinth would be. So to create more balance in the labyrinth, we could create a 2-circuit labyrinth where you walk in, around, do a 180-degree turn, and then come around and you're in the center. Now, this creates some balance in that you're not just spiraling around and around, but you can see there's 180-degree turn, and then you don't have the right-handed turn to match the left-handed turn. So just like in yoga, when you stretch to the right, you want to then stretch to the left. And this is an image of yoga on the labyrinth at Grace Cathedral. You can see hundreds of people typically would go there every Tuesday evening for a yoga session on the labyrinth. So this is a 3-circuit labyrinth, and you can see now we have the balance where you enter in, you take a 90-degree turn to the left, you come around a 180-degree turn to the right, you come around a 180-degree turn to the left, and then a 90-degree turn to the right. And so you have that balance of right turn, left turn. And there's a theory that this is actually working in the hemispheres of the brain, that as you're physically moving your body left to right and right to left, that you are balancing your hemispheres, and people really do feel in the labyrinth this kind of melding of their right and left brain, or their, creative self and their rational self. But the one thing that is missing from this labyrinth is the meander, which is another archetypal form that we've seen on Greek and Roman designs and vases especially. And if you include a meander into the labyrinth design, then you walk into the center and then away from the center, out all the way to the perimeter and around back in. And so this is actually the archetypal labyrinth. This is a 3-circuit classical labyrinth, which has all the basic components. So this would be the simplest form that includes the circle, the spiral, the meander, the balance, and the entrance and center. So you have all the pieces together in this simplest expression of the labyrinth. And so labyrinths have popped up, have evolved in places all over the world. Not in every country and culture, but in many, including the Native American Southwest. There's the man in the maze design. In South America, you have the Nazca lines in Peru. In North Africa, there were some labyrinths. In fact, the first church labyrinth installed in the world inside of a church was in North Africa. In India, there is a Chakravayu labyrinth, which developed out of a Hindu epic tale. And then in northern Russia and the Baltic, you see stone labyrinths. And then, of course, they were also installed in Europe. And so I had the extreme fortune to go with Jeff Sayward, the labyrinth historian, on a tour to Sweden. And Sweden has more surviving ancient and historic labyrinths than any country in the world. And so we went to this island of Gotland that has 40 incredible examples of labyrinths. And I was enthralled by this fresco of this giant labyrinth in the back of this medieval church. But Jeff is over there photographing something on the wall. That I said, well, Jeff, what are you taking a picture of? Aren't you interested in the labyrinth? And he said, look, here, there's a little carved graffito of a labyrinth pattern. And to many, that wouldn't quite, come across as a labyrinth. But what it is actually the seed pattern for the classical labyrinth design. And you don't need to know how to draw the full classical labyrinth. All you need to know is how to draw the seed pattern. And if you can draw the seed, then you connect the dots and lines, and you form the classical labyrinth. And so the theory is that people pass the seed, they taught the seed to other people, or they drew it and passed the seed to others, and then they created their own labyrinths from seed, which is really, I think, a beautiful image. So what I'll invite you to do right now is to pause the recording and find a piece of paper and draw a labyrinth from the seed pattern. So you need a piece of paper, maybe a pencil with an eraser, and you want to begin on the bottom third of your piece of paper. So don't put your seed pattern in the middle, put it at the bottom kind of third. You can see it's at the bottom of this image. And you want to draw a plus sign, and then 4 of these kind of 90-degree turns or right angles, kind of L shapes, and then 4 dots. And the whole thing is kind of in a square, right? Then from the center line, you want to go up and over and connect it to the L, or the turn. And that actually forms the center of the labyrinth. And then you do it again from the next one over, either dot or line, whichever you come to next, and you do a rainbow kind of up and over to connect to the next dot. And you keep doing this over and over again, dot to line, dot to line, dot to line, dot to line, dot to line. Always going up and over, up and over, up and over, like a rainbow. And you end up with the 7-circuit classical labyrinth. You've drawn 8 loops, which make 7 pathways, or 7 circuits. Really there's only one path, which is why we call it circuits. Because, there's not 7 pathways, there's just one path. And what's fascinating is actually this 7-circuit classical labyrinth is 2 3-circuit labyrinths put together. So you take 2 3-circuit labyrinths plus 1 connecting path equals the 7-circuit classical labyrinth. And there's a larger 3-circuit on the outside and a smaller 3-circuit on the inside. And that is actually the same form of the classical labyrinth that we saw in that evolution of design that I shared earlier. So when you're drawing the classical labyrinth from the seed, if you stop after 4 loops up and over, you end up with the 3-circuit classical labyrinth, and you can erase the bottom half of the seed pattern. But if you continue connecting all the pathways and loops, then you end up with the full form, the full 7-circuit classical labyrinth. So really, I've taught you how to draw 2 different labyrinths, the 3-circuit and the 7-circuit today. So labyrinths are an archetype, and I love this quote by Dan Johnston, which is, "A labyrinth is an archetypal symbol of life's journey. An archetypal symbol is one embedded into mankind over a long evolutionary history. It develops out of an almost infinite repetition of typical human experiences. Similar symbols arise in all cultures, and that is what makes them archetypal. An archetypal symbol is a container of energy. It can bring motivation and meaning to life. Archetypes are deep within us and await awakening. As an archetypal symbol, a labyrinth has power. It has an energy with which we can have a direct experience. Unlike many other archetypes, which remain abstract, we can physically get into and walk around in a labyrinth." So I love that idea that the labyrinth is an archetype, that has this history and, tradition and evolution, through thousands of years. The oldest labyrinths are maybe 4,000 to 6,000 years old. We find them on rock carvings in Western Spain. But they can't be dated precisely because they're just carvings on a wall. The oldest that we can date precisely is from Pylos, Greece, from 1200 BC. So that's 3,200 years, at least, that the labyrinth has been in existence. But the labyrinth is something that's not just a symbol that you put on the wall or that you look at. It's a symbol that you can actually engage in, that you can create on the ground and walk. You can immerse yourself in the experience of the archetype, which I think is really the power and opportunity of this for ourselves. My favorite labyrinth in the world is on the island of Gotland, Sweden, where I was with Jeff. And this is the 11 circuit classical labyrinth. So you can also expand the classical labyrinth to be larger than smaller as well. So you can go from 7 to 3, but you can also go up from 7 to 11 or even 15 circuits. So this is a 11 circuit classical labyrinth that may be, at least 300 to 400 years old, but could be much older, made of field stones on the ground of Sweden. The most famous labyrinth in the world is in Chartres Cathedral in France, and that's an 800-year-old labyrinth that goes back to 1200 AD. And this is an overview of the design, which you can see is very intricate. It involves more symbolism, the rosette in the center, the lunations around the perimeter, and more turns in the design. So there's no history of exactly why or how the labyrinth was used when it was first inlaid in the nave of the cathedral. But many see it as a symbolic pilgrimage or, a personal reflection of the journey to God. And, for some, the labyrinth is a religious practice, but, it can also be a spiritual practice, a meditative practice, a mindfulness practice, or even just a practice of stress reduction and healing, because the labyrinth really predates the church. There was kind of a period at the beginning in the 1990s that it was mostly dowsers that were using labyrinths. And then Lauren Artress brought it to Grace Cathedral, and many churches started using labyrinths. And then it kind of spread to retreat centers. And then, now many schools are bringing labyrinths into consciousness. And, there's kind of different shifts in backyards right now during the pandemic. Many people are creating labyrinths in their backyards, which has been the bulk of my design work this year. And the reason really is that the labyrinth is a mirror to ourselves. And by walking the labyrinth and looking at it, we can find, a deeper connection to our own inner wisdom. Things will arise, feelings, thoughts, questions, that typically on a day-to-day we're so busy in our ritualistic schedule or connected by the internet that we don't take time to really listen to what's going on in our subconscious. And the labyrinth really is an opportunity to engage in the subconscious. You can drop into that space very quickly, much more quickly for myself than I can do in a sitting meditation. And sometimes, you do encounter the shadow side. So, this is kind of the minotaur, in the center of the labyrinth. But, the labyrinth is not always like peace, just like meditation. Sometimes meditation can be very challenging, and it can be very difficult, and hard things can come up. But the labyrinth is a container for that stuff to arise, because you can be in a safe space. You can have difficult emotions or thoughts arise, and you have created a space for yourself to process that, to work through it, and that way, you're not going to hold on to that as long as you would by suppressing it, And so the labyrinth can be a great space for processing difficult emotions as well as peaceful ones. And you can also walk it in groups. Some people only like walking labyrinths with other people, and they feel the support of a facilitated group walk. And others prefer to walk the labyrinth just by themselves, because they want to have a more private, individual experience. So maybe you've walked a labyrinth in a group and felt like it wasn't for you, but you haven't taken the opportunity to walk the labyrinth alone, and see how that feels. And the same thing, maybe you've walked a labyrinth indoors but haven't experienced one outside. So I would invite you to experience a variety of different types of labyrinths. There's so many different forms. Even though it's a single archetype, there's many different designs and expressions and materials and settings and intentions. This is a kind of rainbow labyrinth on Vancouver Island that reflects the ocean. It has little crabs and clams, painted along the pathway, and a starfish bench, in the center, which is is really cool. So, a kind of fun community labyrinth. This is a quadruple spiral labyrinth, so a contemporary labyrinth. And now there's, hundreds, if not thousands, of new designs that are being created. And so you can also experience these different forms that are not archetypal, because they don't have that tradition and history, but they're new opportunities to engage in this geometric form. Here's one that is a pentagon with a star in the center, made out of flagging ribbon. So another way to make a temporary labyrinth just with flagging ribbon and lawn staples on a grass lawn. And finally, I thought, as healing touch practitioners, you would really enjoy this labyrinth by artist Maya Scott in San Francisco. And she created a design in the shape of a hand, and it has a spiral center, and you wind your way through the fingers. And she created this installation of the hand labyrinth, actually with cutouts of her hand. And you can see she's laid them all out on the floor of this convention hall. So I really love this design by Maya, and if you're interested in using it or adapting it, please contact her, because people kind of take designs from wherever without acknowledging the artist, and this is Maya Scott. And finally, here's a heart-shaped labyrinth on the beach in Vancouver Island. And so you can create labyrinths in other shapes as well, not just circles, but the hand, the pentagon, or the heart. And it's not traditional to have these different shapes, although the square labyrinth does go back to actually that oldest labyrinth in Pylos, Greece from 1200 BC was actually a square labyrinth. But 95% of labyrinths are circles, although you can make them into different shapes. And today we see people creating labyrinths of all different forms, including the heart labyrinth. If you go online, there's a website called the Worldwide Labyrinth Locator, and you can search for labyrinths in your community. Or if you're going on a trip somewhere, you can search, like Sweden, the island of Gotland, you can search and find the labyrinths, if you were going on a trip to Sweden and wanted to see labyrinths there. So I would encourage you to go on the Labyrinth Locator and find a labyrinth near you to walk and experience. So labyrinths don't have to be walkable to engage in the archetype. You can also create tabletop labyrinths out of small objects. Anything you have a lot of, you can build a labyrinth out of. And I had a collection of bottle caps from like 10 years, and I didn't know what to do with them. They were in a bag. But I realized that I could use the labyrinth to create a tabletop labyrinth, and I did that to create a home altar for Day of the Dead. And what was interesting is that the labyrinth, as I reflected on it, there were stories coming up from friends and family about alcoholism during that time. And so I started, the labyrinth kind of took on a new reflection, of my life and relationships. And this is a 5-circuit chart variation that I created out of sea glass. And so different materials will take on different symbolism or give a different energy to the labyrinth. And I invite you to create a tabletop labyrinth out of any small objects you might have at home. Even coins or buttons or, matchsticks, anything could really become a labyrinth. As many of you work in health care, I wanted to share some examples of labyrinths in hospitals, which has been a recent trend, maybe in the last 5 to 10 years, that a lot of hospitals are incorporating labyrinths now as part of their wellness offerings. And this is a labyrinth at Riley Children's Hospital in Indianapolis. And you can see it's centrally located and available for the staff, patients, and their families to walk because, talk about a time of transition or upheaval, feeling of chaos in life, the hospital environment. To create this outdoor space is really a gift to the population there. This is a 7-circuit classical labyrinth at a Kaiser hospital here in San Leandro, California. It's made of recycled glass, and you can see it's right, close by the entrance of the hospital, so you can actually, see it as you're walking by. The Kaiser hospitals in California, Kaiser Permanente, have actually made the intention of including a labyrinth in all of the new hospitals that they are building. So that site in San Leandro just had one built. This is a labyrinth in Vacaville, California, using artificial turf and decomposed granite. This is a labyrinth at a hospital on Vancouver Island, more simple grass pathway with inlaid pavers to create the design. And this is a hard surfaced labyrinth at the Dales, Oregon hospital. And it actually doubles as a helicopter pad. So, labyrinths can be multi-use spaces. If you're going to have a helipad, might as well make it a labyrinth, just with the proper light, warning system so that, the helicopter would land unimpeded by your walk. Or your walk would be unimpeded by a helicopter. This is also a temporary labyrinth, a carpet labyrinth at the University of Kentucky Chandler Hospital. So if a hospital is resistant to creating a permanent labyrinth, a good way to introduce labyrinths to the hospital environment, it would be a temporary labyrinth with a canvas labyrinth that you could unfold, or this is a carpet labyrinth that could be simply vacuumed and it could be moved around and not as expensive as a inlaid stone labyrinth outside. And then the other thing is that many people are using finger labyrinths these days, and finger labyrinths are great in healthcare environments because they are low cost and they can be disinfected. And if you're not able to move, physically through the labyrinth, you can do a sitting meditation, but tracing your finger through the labyrinth to have that experience. And, the labyrinth can be symbolic. It doesn't have to be circumnavigated physically. Hospital patients have reported, simply looking out their window and seeing the labyrinth, as a symbol can be metaphorical for them, and to watch someone else walk the labyrinth can also be healing and grounding and stress reducing. So, there are apps on phone. There's a Labyrinth Journeys app that is free that you can trace a labyrinth with your finger on a phone or a tablet. And here are some labyrinths that I personally have created for healthcare environments. This is a labyrinth at Napa State Hospital for the art therapists that use the labyrinth to walk with mental health patients. This is a labyrinth at a mental health residence where they were going to outlaw smoking. And they wanted to provide the patients an opportunity to be outdoors and breathe and have a ritual that's not smoking a cigarette, And if you think about smoking as like taking time outside of your schedule to breathe, that's very actually mindful and in line with, walking a labyrinth or being outdoors and going on a meditative labyrinth walk for 5 minutes. So this was kind of the smoking replacement or offering, instead of smoking. Finally, this is kind of the most favorite labyrinth that I have created. It is a Baltic wheel labyrinth, which has a separate entrance and exit. So you can also have a labyrinth, instead of retracing your steps back out from the center, you can walk into the center and then walk out a separate pathway so that it's just a one-way street. And this is a labyrinth that I created at the Earl Baum Institute of the Blind. And it had to have paths wide enough to accommodate wheelchairs and dogs, sight dogs, but also it needed to have raised edges so that you could use a cane. So it's a simple 4-circuit labyrinth, only 4 pathways around the center. But it can accommodate a real diversity of experiences of walking the labyrinth. So my last portion of this presentation is to invite you to experience a finger labyrinth. And at the conference, I'm actually hosting a live finger labyrinth walk experience, which you may participate in, or you could watch the recording of if you'd like to have a guided finger labyrinth walk. And finger labyrinths, especially in the pandemic, have been the way that many people have been engaging in the labyrinth at home. If they're unable to go outside or, visit a labyrinth that is unavailable during this period. And one of the most popular forms of the finger labyrinth is wood, and usually it's carved in the wood so that you can feel the pathway, even with your eyes closed. You can feel it with your finger as you go through. But you could also learn to draw a labyrinth and then use the drawing as your finger labyrinth. So even with the seed pattern that I taught you earlier in this presentation, or you can go on my YouTube channel, and I have many, many free videos. And then on Teachable, I have an account where you can do really in-depth drawings, tutorials. But you can learn how to draw a labyrinth and then use that as your finger labyrinth. Also, you can find them in metal and use a stylus instead of using your finger. You may find, if the labyrinth especially is small, that it would be easier to use like a pencil or a wand or a stylus to trace. This is a sand labyrinth that Lauren Arches created, and this is a three-dimensional spherical labyrinth that I created through a workshop by Charlotte Weinkoop. And labyrinths can really take all different forms and materials. And I am a faculty member with Veritas, which is the nonprofit founded by Lauren Arches to educate and expand the use and awareness of labyrinths. And we have been hosting online finger walks every Friday afternoon. If you go on the Veritas website, you can tune in to future finger labyrinth walks. And we've had about 150 people every week joining us for these labyrinth meditations online. And about 3 weeks ago, I asked everyone on the call to write in the words of the different phases and experiences and things that they had been going through in the past 5 months of the pandemic. And then I made a word cloud of all the different things that people responded to. And you can see that this labyrinth actually has the different words of things that are coming up for people in their journey through the last 5 months of the pandemic. And actually now we're in October, and 7 months, depending on where you are, the length of the time that you've been on this journey, alone and together. So we've really found a deeper appreciation for finger labyrinths, especially at this time. And walking finger labyrinths in groups is also something new that has really come up in the last 2-3 months. That before we used to walk labyrinths in groups and do finger labyrinths alone. Now it's kind of the opposite. We're walking labyrinths alone and using finger labyrinths in groups, So I think that that's really an interesting inverse experience or situation that's happening these days. So Lauren Arches offered this quote in her book, Walking a Sacred Path, which is a great primer about the kind of reemergence of the labyrinth in her life and her use of it. She writes, "Labyrinths are powerful blueprints that order chaos, offer a path of prayer, heal deep wounds of..." She writes, "Labyrinths are powerful blueprints that order chaos, offer a path of prayer, heal deep wounds, serve as a place of solace, and transform human consciousness, individually and in community. The labyrinth offers a spiritual exercise that becomes the path of life. It allows the wandering soul to find a center, to find a way home." So, especially in this time of upheaval and uncertainty and high anxiety, you could create a finger labyrinth for yourself or lead this as an exercise with a client or a community to create a labyrinth that reflects their journey through the pandemic or through, whatever period of transition is going on in their lives. And so I created this pandemic labyrinth for myself, a kind of an art project where I divided the labyrinth into the number of days so that each little stone represented one day of the time through the pandemic. And it was a 5 circuit labyrinth representing the 5 months that we had been through. So in the handouts for this lecture, I've actually provided some 7 circuit patterns, which I think could reflect the 7 months that we've been through the pandemic. If it began in mid-March or early April, then October would be our kind of 7 months. So you could print out these patterns that I've provided in the handouts, and I've left the line open as well, so you can color in the labyrinth, whatever color you like, and then I invite you to write words in the pathway of your experience. And it can either be literal, where each circuit represents a different month, or it can be just free form, just writing everything that comes up for you on this path. And when I created my labyrinth, what I did was I wrote in the center my home and my refuge and what I held sacred, and outside the labyrinth I wrote the things that were the outside world, fear and anxiety, things that I felt like were outside of my refuge, the pandemic, the smoke, the masks, wearing masks, all these things outside, hand sanitizer, all this stuff around the perimeter, and the labyrinth being the sacred space or the container. And I like this emotion wheel by Geoffrey Roberts, which you could find online, and it has the main emotions, but it allows you to go deeper into deeper levels of emotion. And what I like what Geoffrey has done is that he's color-coded emotions to different colors. And so you can actually color in your labyrinth using colors representing different emotional, phases or states that you've been through on this pandemic journey. And about 3 weeks ago through Veritas, I led a workshop on creating emotional maps using the labyrinth as an archetype to reflect on our journey through the pandemic. And so I invite you also to create your own emotional map, and you can use words, color, expressions, and these are examples from my students. One from Molly Strange. She actually rubbed a finger labyrinth and created a rubbing, which she used as the model for her design. This is one by Emma Kupu Mitchell, which shows kind of a watercolor effect of her journey. And then this labyrinth by Millie Jackson, who colored and wrote on the labyrinth and then cut it out and put it onto a different color piece of paper, with reflections and mantras, and you can then use this labyrinth to kind of process what you've gone through in the past 7 months, to better move through this, so that you're not carrying the weight of all of this that we've been through into the future. So in summary, why experience a labyrinth, or why introduce it to other people? It allows you to connect to the present moment, which is always a good practice, to really be here now. You can cultivate a sense of the sacred, to really identify, what is sacred to you in time and in space. Create a personal practice or a ritual, to have something that you can go back to day after day, when things are going crazy and everything is changing, to have something that you can return to that feels familiar, that you can do in times of grief and in times of happiness, that same path. Engage in an ancient archetype, so an opportunity to be in a space not only that's going to go through different phases of your life, but has gone through different phases of history, and real tragic, periods of history, and then real positive periods of growth and advancement. You can reconnect to your environment. You can, especially outdoors, if you create a labyrinth, that will help you to connect to your outdoor space. But even indoors, it can help you to connect to your home and to your environment of your heart. Which brings us to linking your mind, body, and spirit. The labyrinth is very powerful in integrating, your mind, your body, and your spirit. And in moving through the labyrinth, I feel like you really get an incredible cohesion of these different things, interplay kind of those different realms. To me, labyrinths really bring a sense of order to chaos, so they are a sure path for uncertain times. It is a time away from schedule or the internet. So when you use labyrinths or facilitate other people to use the labyrinth, I would invite them to turn off their cell phones and to really take time, unrestricted time and uninterrupted time, to take the walk and go on the journey. Labyrinths is a form of exercise and stress reduction. So certainly, just walking outside, or it can be beneficial just to get you out and walking and breathing and stretching. It can enhance focus and creativity. People use labyrinths to artistically enliven themselves. It's an opportunity to gather community together. So, labyrinths are a great way to bring together different people from all walks of life. You can tap into your own inner wisdom. Really, it's not the labyrinth teaching you anything. It's you teaching yourself, the lessons of the labyrinth. But they're coming out of you. You are your own teacher. You understand your own needs the best, and so if you can walk into the labyrinth, then that can really help you to hear what your underlaying wisdom is. And finally, there's the potential for healing and transformation. You don't want to promise that the labyrinth is going to heal somebody, that you're going to walk into the labyrinth and, as Lauren Archer says, Shazam. You're not gonna get Shazammed in the labyrinth, but there are many stories of people that have felt healed by the labyrinth experience and gone through personal transformation, including myself. So thank you for joining me on this journey today. I share my story not to elevate myself, but to just provide an example of how the labyrinth can help in times of transition and upheaval. 15 years ago, when that 8-year relationship ended and my life was thrown into chaos, it felt like a shipwreck. It felt like the boat that I was on had crashed and splintered into 100,000 pieces. And this is actually a labyrinth that I created out of a shipwreck on the coast of Half Moon Bay while I was living there. And this, I think, is the perfect metaphor, because I took the pieces of my broken life and I reassembled them back together into a new form. And from the fishing boat became a labyrinth, and it became a sacred space and a ritual. And the labyrinth really gave me the container and form to find myself again, to ground myself, return to my center, and better understand the identity of who I was, and to align myself in that identity. And so for those that might ask, I did find love again, and created this labyrinth with my fiance at the time. At our 1-year anniversary, we made this labyrinth of new beginnings in the forest of Half Moon Bay. And the labyrinth is still there, and she's now my wife. And 4 years after that, we gave birth to this little labyrinth walker. And now we're a family of 3. And so, for my professional life and my personal life, the labyrinth really helped me get through a really difficult time and find myself again. So I'm sure there'll be more twists and turns on the journey, and We're especially going through that right now, individually and collectively through the pandemic. And, Lauren Artris says that there's no better tool that she knows for processing grief than the labyrinth. And if we're not grieving a personal loss right now, we may be grieving just the fact that we couldn't go to the conference and take that trip. There's so many places that I would have gone this past 6 months that I wasn't able to go to, or to see my parents who live in North Carolina, my daughter's grandparents. I'm not going to see them this year. And so that's a loss that I'm grieving. And, the labyrinth is a great place to take that sorrow to. And the labyrinth is also an open source archetype. It's an ancient archetype, but because no one knows exactly where or why the first labyrinth was created, you can use the labyrinth for whatever end, fits you. And so, it's open source in the sense that it's an ancient archetype, but there's no one to say that this is the right way or the only way to use a labyrinth. So I also invite you to find new ways to use labyrinths, new ways to make labyrinths, new places to put labyrinths, new forms, to create the labyrinth experience. Really, the journey is yours. And I look forward to connecting with you at the Q&A. If you're watching this in the first couple days of the conference, then we have a Q&A on day 3. But otherwise, you can also watch the Q&A recording if you like. And then there is a facilitated finger walk where you can use a finger labyrinth, and I will show you the basic guidelines for tracing a labyrinth with your finger. And then be sure to check the resources to download some printable finger labyrinths to create your own, color your own, write your own. And I also am providing guidelines with how to use finger labyrinths and walking labyrinths in the resources as well. So again, my name is Lars Howlett. Thank you very much for joining me. And my website is discoverlabyrinths.com. Peace on your path.